Thank you. Well,
thank you for doing this.
Thank you, and thank you for asking me to come and present.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's an honour really, because I had a look at some of the other papers and I kind of think about mine and I think, well, there are some that are far more worthy of their authors coming and talk. But yeah, so what this paper's about really is something that's evolved several years back. And it was part of my involvement on one of our MSc programs. We have a program in here. So what I want to talk to you about is some exploratory activity and some development within a curriculum that actually in retrospect, and it was speaking to Liz at a conference in Glasgow in July, and we started talking. It was, I'd only met her for a few days, and she was interested in what I was doing and what I had done, and I started to explore with her some work we had done on one of our master's modules. And she said to me, she said, "Oh, do you know what you've been doing there? You've been doing Entrustable professional activities." And I thought about it, and I looked at the literature and thought, do you know what, I have actually been doing what the literature has talked about. So it's very inductive, this. And the more I explored what we had actually done in this module, the more I realised it's actually aligned to EPAs. So this is kind of an exploratory approach about one module. But actually, having looked at the literature and having reviewed the application of this, there is a vast opportunity to look at ways in which this can be embedded, not just within sports science education, but actually a number of different practice-based modules that we run across the college and also across the institution. So what I want to talk to you is just about what's in the paper really, you know, kind of our exploration, my exploration of this, the process I went through, and then the next steps and the opportunities that there are that precede kind of this inductive approach to embedding professional activities within our curriculum and working with the students. So what I want to talk about is a number of areas. My interest in this area, what Entrustable professional activities are, how they build upon our understanding of competency-based teaching and learning, or competency-based education. And the research around this actually stems from Canada a number of years ago, from the Medical Association, where they have within their professional accreditation Entrustable professional activities that are deeply embedded in their requirements to practice. And then through North America, more research evolved, Australia research has evolved, and in the literature, when you look at things around veterinary sciences, this is where Liz knew about it, healthcare professions, there is a good, strong body of evidence about the usefulness and the transferability of EPAs, Entrustable activities, in developing students, in enabling them to be more aware of their own personal competencies, but be prepared for what the professions require of them. Talk a little bit about how I try to embed it in a practical curriculum, and then what opportunities exist. And I kind of wrote this up, sent it into Kate, and you know the professionality of this review process has been fantastic. The feedback has been great. I mean, it really has. So thank you ever so much for that. My interest in the area, well, I'm a sports scientist by trade, I suppose by background. I've been an accredited practitioner for 10 years, between 2005 and 2015. I've been accredited through our professional body, so that's the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science, in consultancy, physiological consultancy. I've had to provide portfolios of work, I've had to work with a number of different client groups, individual teams, local sports groups, international athletes, and I've built up a degree of expertise and a portfolio of work. So my interest in this is around applied practice and about preparing the student to be able to undertake unsupervised professional activity in the workplace, and that's critical. So in the development of this module, it was very important to me to ensure that the students, as they come through this module, have that same degree of entrustment, in that me as a supervisor can entrust them to undertake something independent of me in a professional context, but in a safe context. And that was the driver as I started to develop this module and think about what the literature supports, particularly from sport and exercise science, supports that underpinning. So when we think about entrustable professional activities, we're thinking about professional activities that the profession demands need to be undertaken effectively, safely, and in accordance with any regulatory or standard framework. So it might be in a healthcare setting, something like taking blood. It might be about taking blood pressure. It might be about patient care, patient management, patient safety, and it might be about a particular assessment around a client or a patient. But it's about what the profession requires that is necessary. It's not about the individual's competencies or skills. And as I said, this has kind of been developed through a number of different areas within the medical and the healthcare profession. So an entrustable professional activity is built up of a number of personal competencies. So they may be skills, they may be attitudes, and they may be beliefs. And collectively, they lead to a professional activity that we entrust that individual, we charge that individual to undertake in a safe and effective way. And as this process of supervisory support occurs, it's about delivering their student or the learner to a point of mastery. So we take them through a process of greater supervision, where initially when we work with them to develop this professional activity, we provide lots of input, we drive a lot of the activity, we lead their learning, we engage with their understanding, until a point where we take them through minimal supervision until they are ready to practice independently. And we lead from a lesser entrustment to a greater entrustment. And I'll explain as I go through this presentation how actually that was my thinking in terms of the development of a particular module in order to ensure that our students were entrusted before they then went on to a second module within the MSc programme. So an EPA is an operationally defined professional activity that's associated with operational tasks. It's not about the individual, it's about what that profession requires in order to undertake that profession effectively in an efficacious way. So it's about safe and effective practice. It's about a unit of work that profession requires. And that requires knowledge, it requires skills, it requires attitudes, it requires a particular belief system around that. That's the individual competencies that collectively build in order for that student or that practitioner to be able to be interested and deliver that. It's about something that's observable, it can be independently executed, it's built within a time frame, and it's a conglomerate of the student's competencies to conduct that. So part of this is about the student, the learner, the practitioner understanding the relationship between the competencies that they develop and the end professional activity that they will deliver. And the objectives of effective teaching and learning, therefore, in embedding a professional activity within the curriculum is to take a student through this process. That when we start with our curriculum delivery, we start at a point of lower entrustment and greater supervisory support, and we take them to a process of greater entrustment and lesser supervisory support. And the objective is that hopefully at the end of that curriculum, that learner is charged with an independence to undertake that safely and effectively. They become masters, in effect, of that particular activity. So therefore the entrustment point is defined as the point where we, through our investment, provide the charge or the responsibility of that learner, that practitioner, to then go and undertake that professional activity independently from us. And obviously that requires that learner and that student to develop a number of individual or domain competencies to get to that point. So that's the kind of the underpinning rationale and structure of what an EPA consists of. So within sports science education, and from my context as a practitioner and an educator of this, I see it's important that we are able to ensure that the student is able to provide a safe and unsupervised, evidence-based practical service to a client group. That's what we're trying to do. So at the end of any training or any support or any educational experience, one would hope that that learner is able to then apply all of those skills, competencies, and deliver a professional activity, which is evidence-informed, is safe, is effective, and takes into account the objectives of any assessment or any requirement, as well as the management of patient or client safety. So that's critical to me. So that's kind of a guiding principle that is important in terms of applied sports science education. And that was the guiding principle that started my thinking about how do we ensure that we develop a practical curriculum that enables the professional development of a student as a practitioner. There's good evidence within the sports science literature that gets us to think about what are the competencies necessary in order for a student to be able to deliver, ensure that they can provide that safe, unsupervised, so entrusted series of activities when working with a number of clients, built around reflective practice, self-assessment, maintaining positive relationships. There are also some functional domain competencies as well. So when we talk about applied sports science, we're talking about, particularly for me, we're talking about assessment, evaluation of a client group to identify what their current status is, but also how do we ensure that we can improve that current status. So it's about performance enhancement or individual enhancement. So part of the other functional domains that are important are around athlete diagnosis, consultation, assessment administration, intervention management. These are all benchmarks that lead to competent practitioners. But in themselves, they're not professional activities. They are a conglomerate of competency domains. So in an educational setting, things that we typically do in sports science, we would look at undertaking observation, laboratory reporting, portfolios, to look at the skills and the knowledge that the student is able to impart through their writing or through their practical work, and identify a number of competencies that they are able to exhibit. So those competencies are things around their personal skills, their knowledge and their attitudes, so their professional conduct, their professional behaviours. So the way that we kind of traditionally assessed is very much around competency-based practice, but doesn't necessarily lead to what the profession demands of us in terms of what is required from a professional activity point of view. And I'll give an illustration of how that looks. So just because we reach a level of competency in each of these domains, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can conduct the activity that the profession demands of us. So we might have good interpersonal skills with a client. We might be able to do a particular, put a needle on a syringe, but are we able to actually undertake a very effective, safe sampling of blood with a client taking into account their safety, the effectiveness of our practice, and collect completely what we need to. So we can break that down into individual competencies, but as a professional activity, the individual competencies aren't necessarily complete the whole picture. So when we think about the physiological assessment of an athlete, which is things that I'm interested in and been involved in, and obviously as part of our curriculum we want the students to have a professional approach to, they can do this safely and effectively, they may be able to have a scientific understanding of a system, a physiological system. They may be able to calibrate a piece of equipment. They might be able to ensure that any materials that they're going to use are safe and there's some hygiene control. They may be able to operate the ergometer. They may be able to turn it on and turn it off. They might be able to set the grade. They might be able to change the speed. They might be able to understand the precision of that, which are competency-based domains, but put them in a live situation where we require them in a real-world professional-based activity to undertake an assessment within 90 minutes, to get the client in, to do a full evaluation, to give them some report, which is what the profession demands of us. They're the type of activities that we are expected to deliver. Then those particular competencies don't necessarily add up to the complete professional activity. So although the competencies are critical, for the students to master, they do not ensure complete entrustment at a level that's necessary by the profession. We could take our students through each of these individual parts and then ask them to undertake a live 90-minute assessment with an athlete. And unless they've been able to contextualise and to build that into a series of professional activities in their learning, they would struggle to be able to undertake that particular assessment. So that was the starting point around how do we ensure, if this is necessary from the literature and the profession, we build up a series of activities within our teaching and learning so that we can entrust our students to be able to undertake a professional activity, an assessment, ahead of them moving on to another module where they're going to need to use that independently. Critics of competency-based training argue that the development of personal competencies alone do not ensure or enable entrustment of a professional activity. So we could take our student through a curriculum where we develop their individual competencies, but the literature would suggest that to be able to apply all of those and in a jigsaw and to undertake a professional activity creates some challenge for the learner. They may not be translatable from one context to another. So we learn a competency in isolation or coupled together, but we can't contextualise them. We can't contextualise them into a professional activity. So therefore it can be a challenge to be able to translate those and transfer those. The literature is consistent around competency checklists. So we go through a student, we've got a number of competencies, maybe around communication skills, around respect for others, around some of their skills, and we basically are looking for those and we tick them off as a checklist. But the challenges with that is that we know that in the profession, the activities we undertake are changeable, they're dynamic, they're adaptable. Working with an athlete in a 90-minute assessment, it's a very dynamic, changeable situation. So preparing the student based on competency-based training alone, the evidence would suggest doesn't prepare them for those changeable environments and situations that we know are going to happen when those students leave and they have to work in the workplace. And also deconstructing professional activities into single competencies has been suggested to reduce individual professional development, maybe destroy ways of thinking differently, problem solving, and enabling more holistic care and support for clients. So there is a good base of evidence that actually demonstrate that EPAs do develop a learner, a practitioner, to be more adaptable, transferable, and be able to problem solve in new, unique situations, which is exactly what we're trying to kind of create in our graduates. So I tried to, in my development of a module, try and think about how do we ensure that we build this on a professional series of activities. So initially I went to the literature that we had in the sports science field. We've got literature around our use of assessments. British Association of Sport and Exercise Science put together an assessment framework. They've got books on assessment, physiological assessment. Australian Institute of Sport put together books on assessment. There's been a number of others that have been produced from leading practitioners and academics in this country on assessment. So I use those as a starting point to look at what does the literature, what do the professionals demand of us as practitioners to ensure that we're able to undertake a series of professional activities. But also it's to ensure that we can somehow develop the student so at the end of a module they're able to then transfer that and develop that further in an independent way. They're able to apply in different spaces within their curriculum, and also there's that self-recognition of assurance that they are themselves entrusted and have the confidence. So they were kind of some of the principles that, again, govern this. Again, there's growing evidence around the legitimacy of this. However, in the sports science literature, this is very much in its infancy. There's been some work done on competency-based learning in psychology through our British Psychological Society. Our National Association has competency-based frameworks that we can refer to, but it's quite infant in terms of the sense that there are professional units of practice that are required of us. And there are no best practice around EPA developments in the literature. So again, having reviewed this retrospectively, you know, there still is an area of development that's required. So what I did is, in the development of this module, it was a 30-credit sport physiology module, positioned within an MSc programme. It ran for the first term of the programme. The module was split, so it was had a practical component to it, and it had a theoretical component to it. And the theoretical component was assessed independently, but informed some of the theoretical underpinning of the practical component. And the practical component of the module was assessed through way of a live role play. So the students were prepared through the curriculum to undertake a 90-minute assessment with an athlete. And that assessment required them to apply all of their competencies that they developed, but to undertake them to achieve two particular professional activity requirements. One of those was to ensure that the athlete was, that the assessment was undertaken in a safe and effective way, and the other one was that the objectives of the assessment were achieved. So we had two critical professional activities that drove the curriculum that was delivered to the student. And those were the two that the students were informed of, and all of the curriculum led towards. And as I mentioned at the beginning, in effect they were the Entrustable professional activities. Now, it was critical that the students were able to pass those two, because they then moved on to a sports science support module, which required them to be able to demonstrate that independent from the academic tutor. They were having to take an athlete and to do their own self-assessments on them. So it was critical for us in this module to ensure that we gave entrustment to those students. So that contributed to 40% of the module, and then they had an athlete report, and then they had a debate that they had to undertake as well. And as I said, the module objective for the practical curriculum was to ensure that the applied sports scientist, so the student, was able to complete without supervision. So we were assessing, but we didn't supervise the final evaluation. An athlete assessment in a safe, effective manner, capturing the desired outcomes in accordance with the athlete-centred goals. So they understood what the athlete wanted, they undertook the assessment, and they were able to then evaluate that and give them some feedback. And we assessed them on these two critical principles, these two critical professional activities. The reason for selecting this, well, there was already a sense of a basic threshold knowledge and skill set that the students were coming in with. So they'd already undertaken an undergraduate programme from a range of different programme areas. It might have been sport and exercise science, it might have been sports development and coaching. There were some international students, but we knew that there was a baseline understanding and skill set already. So that was a good marker for us. The module needed to prepare students for independence in term 2. So once they finished our module, they then needed to transfer into the next module after Christmas. And the requirement of them was to ensure that they were able to undertake unsupervised applied sports science activity with a client. So we needed the confidence at the end of the module that they were entrusted to do it independent of us. And then thirdly, it was an ambition when this was being built, in that we aligned it to our national accreditation framework. So the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science run an accreditation process. You develop a number of different competences, as they call them, that together provide a portfolio of work that you can then use in an application to become a national accredited practitioner. So it's important that we try to align this, or align the activities that we were going to undertake with the students with that framework. So in the future, the student could use their experiences as an example of the work that they'd undertaken in the programme. So this is kind of what it looked like. I mean, didn't look like that initially, so this is kind of being created, but in effect, this is how it mapped across. So we had the British Association domains. So these were the domains that the association have created that are requirements of the accreditation process. These were the areas that we wanted to develop with the students. So this was taken from the literature. So the British Association of Sport and Exercise Guidelines, the Australian Institute of Sport Guidelines, and a number of different sources that are requirements for effective and safe assessment of an athlete. And then at the top there, we've got the outcome, the component outcome. This is what the students were trying to achieve through their practical assessments. And it was about ensuring that the student was able to undertake unsupervised, a safe, effective assessment in agreement with the athlete-centred goal. So if they're able to achieve that, then they've passed it. And then sat between there, I label these EPA 1 and EPA 2, we've got what we asked the students, or informed students, what they were trying to achieve. So they were trying to achieve athlete safety and welfare. That was critical, and that was made up of a number of different competencies in order to achieve that. And they were trying to achieve undertaking assessment effectively, which was made up of a number of competencies. And you can see how it then mapped to the accreditation domain. So the students were able to see, in undertaking this professional activity at the top, which is a requirement of the profession in order to undertake that assessment, or an assessment, the competencies that were required, and then when they mapped across then to the BASES accreditation domain. We then translate this into a curriculum. So this was our curriculum delivery. So we had 3-hour sessions, 5 of those. We've got our competencies here, so that was taken from the previous table. Our 2 critical professional activity requirements, so undertaking assessment effectively, athlete safety and welfare, and our component objective, again, taken from the previous grid, and then our sessions that we took the students through. And at the end of this, we had our assessment, which was the role play, which was the 90-minute physiological assessment and evaluation with an athlete. During which time, we were interested in assessing these, but it needed to ensure that these were achieved. So we can't have an assessment where we collect the outcomes in accordance with the athlete goals, but it's performed, it's not safe, and we don't take into account the welfare of the athlete. Likewise, we might have an assessment where the athlete is sound and safe, but we don't achieve what we want out of it. So they have 2 professional requirements that are deemed important. So our curriculum kind of covered the critical competencies through the practical delivery. What we did do is we worked with students, or I worked with the students through the practical activity, and we then built an assessment framework, or a co-developed assessment plan. So in order for the student to undertake those 2 professional activities, i.e. achieve their competencies, the athlete had to undertake, in some time sequence, so it goes from 0 to 90 minutes, all of the different activities. And the student was then able to use that to be able to map across to the competencies and the professional activity that we required of them. And there were a number of different requirements that we needed the student to demonstrate, which linked to the competencies in the framework. So that is all the way from starting with the athlete and meeting and greeting them, through collecting some very basic assessment measures, through to kind of appropriate warm-up and getting them prepared for the assessment, undertaking the assessment itself, kind of post-assessment, and then debrief and athlete departure. And through this, we were then able to pull out the competencies and then say, actually, there are component parts of this which enable you to achieve the professional activity of keeping the athlete safe and keeping their welfare at the forefront of your activity. From a student's perspective, and we collected this through modular evaluations at the end, they found that there was an opportunity to work independently. They were able to use that assessment framework. They were able to engage in work that was being undertaken in the Human Performance Lab. They were able to be involved in other activities. They were able to get involved in research projects and develop their skill sets and understand those skill sets positioning in relation to their professional activity. And also they were able to then start to see where the profession requires of them those two important component parts. So we had some good feedback from them in terms of how they were able to get more hands-on, how they were able to see the connections between the different parts of the curriculum and how they all linked into the point of entrustment in where they become independent in order to undertake these. So that's kind of in a I don't know how long I've taken, but that's in a nutshell, in effect, how I try to explore developing beyond competency-based learning a series of professional activities that are important for us as applied sports science practitioners. And looking at the evidence and looking at the research, there's some really useful frameworks that are in place that enable us to be able to start to think how we might develop these further. And this is one particular framework where we can start to look at the literature, we can start to look at the profession, we can start to make contact with the industry and think about what does the profession require of us so that we can then build our professional activities and our practical activities based on what the profession wants, rather than just a series of competencies that we don't know whether necessarily map to the profession. And we can then work in conjunction with the student to start to develop that. And in developing this further, that's something that I didn't do in developing this, and that's something that I think there's an opportunity to do that, to kind of develop the student engagement and student partnership in this. So professional entrustable activities have a position in sport and exercise science. They lift us beyond a mere competency-based approach to practice. They connect competencies together so that we're able to see what is it that is required of us as a profession in terms of our ability to undertake these activities, just as we see in the medical and the healthcare areas of practice. We can link it in with our national association, we can link it in with particular frameworks of practice that already exist, and also we can very easily deconstruct professional activities into competency-based outcomes and lose sight of what the profession requires of us as practitioners. As I said, we can strengthen our relationship with industry partners and students, and again, the evidence would suggest that the attitudes to learning, the self-autonomy, the entrustment, the professional practice, the skills, the confidence, the professional growth, resilience of the student is enhanced when we're able to identify that it's not just about the student developing their skills, it's about them developing a way to work towards what the profession requires of them. It's a much stronger message for the student to embed in their own practice. And it can create more immersive educational experiences. We can start to consider co-designing professional activities around the profession, develop better assessment strategies that mimic workplace requirements, not just what we think the student needs to do in portfolio or observational activity, but it reflects more of the workplace conditions and establishes curriculums that promote more flexible learning journeys. The student can then start to apply some of this. The next steps, well, I'm already in conversation with a company in Ireland called Cubicom that develop a digital platform for EPAs. They've been used extensively in the medical profession. They're very interested in developing this in sports science. I presented a very brief overview of this at our National Association Heads of Department Forum before Easter, and the association are very keen in developing their sense of competency-based education further and think about what the profession requires of us. We have lots of great relationships with community and national partners where our students are now working in terms of their internships and employment areas, and we need to reach out more and ask what the profession requires of us in terms of the activities that they want our students to leave us with. So I think there's great scope here, and this is only one module in one programme, looking at one area. Sports science is made up of a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary connection of disciplines of biomechanics, psychology, physiology, motor learning, and a number of others. So there's great scope here to think about actually how do we move beyond an understanding of competency to start to think about a professional series of activities that we need to ensure our students have entrustment in so they can go on and be more resilient in their workplace activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Any questions?
Sandy.
Mark, thanks, sir. Just a question about when you reach the point of trusting them. So at what point and how did you say, when they're practicing this, I'm available if needed, to the point where I'm in a room, I'm an assessor, I'm not going to step in? Or were you prepared to step in if there was a health and safety issue?
Yes, yes. So I think the point of entrustment is the point of assessment. That was in effect where that point of entrustment came. So if they were able to undertake that assessment in accordance with the assessment criteria, then they were entrusted. But you're absolutely right, and that did happen. It happened on a few occasions where, as assessors, we did have to step in because that professional activity, athlete welfare and safety, had not been reached. There was some compromise. So we did have to step in. And at that point of stepping in, that student was then able to be entrusted to be able to undertake that. So therefore, there was then additional support that was necessary in order to make sure that they were entrusted to do that. But that point of entrustment came at the point of assessment.
But I was wondering if you ever explicitly said, I now trust you, or was it just left to be almost tacitly transition?
Not in such an explicit way, but the messaging was that these are the two component activities that you need to reach. And you passing the assessment is in effect us giving us the confidence that you've reached them. You've reached that ability to be able to undertake that in that safe and effective way, and you've been able to collect the required outcomes that you set yourself with the athlete at the beginning, but not in such an explicit way that you are now an entrusted individual. Yeah.
It's very thorough.
Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Right.